So I hope what you've all seen from Liz's demonstration there is just the marvelous subtlety of all of the different ways in which people use simultaneous speech as a resource for interaction. And what I'm going to talk about in this last section is how we might be able to use some of those resources in the design of CUIs and maybe interrupt them in more subtle and differentiated ways, and also whether they indeed should be able to interrupt us. Next slide, please, Liz. So one thing to note is that we do often already interrupt machines, and Kathy showed us how we do that using barging in automated telephone attendance systems. But we do it even when there's no expectation that the machines can recognize and deal with interruptions. Could you play the example, please, Liz? Thanks.
Medical Centre is now booking flu vaccination appointments. If you are eligible for a flu vaccination and haven't had one yet, please ask reception to book you an appointment.
So this is an example of how we regulate access to medical, well, to the wonderful National Health Service that we have in the UK. Everybody has to call at a certain time. Everybody gets put into an automated attendance system. It doesn't recognise or deal with us using barging, but people do tend to also talk over them. Sometimes these very long kinds of messages that you get when you call your GP surgery. Can we have the next slide, please, Liz? But as Kathy mentioned earlier, even when we do use interruptions with CUIs, that does sometimes actually do the job. We can use the wake word or the hot word as a way of cutting short CUI responses and dealing with other kinds of conversation design problems. So in this example, what you're going to see, what you're going to hear, is a way of dealing with an overlong kind of multi-unit error message that kind of goes on and on. So we're going to see the user coming in just after the first hearable point of the error message's completion, as in design is not in where it says the hub that device TV is connected to is not responding. And then the user uses the wake word and indeed the device cuts off. If you could play that example, thanks, Liz.
Alexa, turn heater off.
Sorry, the hub that device TV connected to is not responding.
Alexa,
please check its network.
Turn off heater.
So you can see this is actually a functional design that users spontaneously implement, and it works reasonably well. But wake words aren't how we usually do interruption. They can effectively claim the floor, as in this example, but they do have some analogues in human interaction in very specific settings. So usually where there are explicit rules about who can speak and when. If we could move on to the next slide, Liz. So one example of this is in, for example, the House of Congress in the United States. There are rules about who can speak and when. This is a clip some of you may recognize. I think it's from 2018, and you'll see Representative Maxine Waters interrupting the former Secretary to the US Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, during a congressional hearing, and where, by the rules, Waters has the right to reclaim her time. And you'll hear her using that phrase if she feels that the person she's questioning isn't answering her questions. Could we play the example, Liz?
I was going to answer that.
Just please go straight to the answer.
Mr. Chairman, I thought when you read the rules, you acknowledged that I shouldn't be interrupted and that I would have
reclaiming my time. What he failed to tell you was when you're on my time, I can reclaim it.
So reclaiming my time works in this context, and you can also think of lawyers in a courtroom saying things like objection. But this isn't usually how we claim turn space. It only works where there are explicit, mutually acknowledged rules and there's a referee to enforce them, as happens later on in this clip. So in everyday talk, these turns are normally organized in ways that don't rely on kind of institutional forms of authority, where only one party can do the interruption, and where there are only so many kinds of actions that conversation design could accomplish if we're using this crude interruption token, like the hot word. What we really want is a range of ways to harness different kinds of simultaneous talk as a resource for solving what Emanuel Shegloff, one of the founders of conversation analysis, describes as the turn-taking problem. Who gets to do what next? So in fact, when we see CUI design using these kind of crude interruption tokens like wake words to manage turn-taking, in some circumstances, these actually cause more problems than they solve. And I'm going to show you an example of that, where there's more than one wake word activated device in the room. Next slide, please. So here, what you're going to see is the user summoning Alexa twice when he means to summon the Siri agent on his phone. And then despite his attempts to interrupt, he really can't get a word in edgeways. I'll play through it sequence by sequence so that you can see what's going on. So first we're going to play the first sequence, and this is a summons response sequence with Alexa, and you can see the response because the wake light comes on, that little blue bar running down the line numbering of the transcript. So if we could play the first sequence, Liz.
Alexa. Alexa.
So that's the silent response, is that wake word coming on. So after the user says wrong one under his breath, we'll then get a second summons response, but this time with Siri. And Siri at this point didn't do the yet, it did the little responsive beep that shows that it's listening for instructions. But because Alexa is also still listening, as you can see from the wake word on line 7, 8, and 9, we also get a kind of wisecrack response from Alexa. If you play the next segment, Liz, thanks.
Hey Siri.
I think you've got me confused with someone else.
So finally, we get the third sequence, and this time it gets confusing. Siri treats Alexa's wisecrack as an instruction and begins to give this very long answer. And here the user attempts to interrupt the chaos using the wake word, but as you can see, it doesn't quite work. Could you play it? Thanks, Liz.
I think you've got me confused with someone else.
I don't know what that means.
Alexa.
If you like, I can search the web for, hey Siri, I think you've got me confused with someone else.
Now, eventually the user actually just gives up in this interaction, and we never find out what the original intention was. But what I want to say here is that, of course, there are device arbitration methods technically that work on a protocol level when we're using compatible devices from the same brand and the same manufacturer. But as more and more CUIs from different manufacturers, some of which use wake words, enter the home, there are good reasons for thinking about opportunities that we have to design more sophisticated approaches to managing interruption and simultaneous talk. Next slide, please, Liz. So a few what ifs. What if in the last example, we'd had forms of interoperable device arbitration on a technical level? So systems maybe that instead of working on a protocol level, listened to the audio in the room and chose when the next turn could be taken, depending on whatever was happening in the environment. One possibility. But then the broader understanding, the more sophisticated differentiation between kinds of simultaneous talk that Liz described earlier could also unlock other possibilities that could involve the CUI even interrupting human speakers. So could a CUI finish a sentence? So when something's on the tip of your tongue, could it maybe hear you doing, what's his name, and then give you a suggestion informed by a contextual search? Or even could we imagine an app that intervenes when somebody in a meeting or in a room makes a sexist or a racist slur, or when one person is dominating in a meeting? And we know from studying workplace interactions that it can be extremely difficult for people to point out that kind of thing in the moment. And even if it's a light-hearted thing, like the kids court Alexa skill, some of you may have seen this, you can open the kids court to deal with children blaming each other for various kinds of things. It could still defer the device, it could defer to the device while still surfacing the problem of a slur or something untoward happening as an issue for discussion without singling anyone out as the complainer.